Welcome back to History 476. I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video 3. Now, before we go any further, let's deal with some of these timing issues for the first videos. Video number 1 lasted 59 minutes and about 51 seconds. Video number 2 was the one that was cut short when I accidentally hit the stop button. It went for about 28:34. Then the next video, which we are going to call video number 2A, went 54 minutes and about 43 seconds. And then here we are on video number 3, which is actually video number 4, but we know that that's okay. All right. So let's start today talking about the Monroe Doctrine. We've already mentioned this to a degree, but it bears repeating that we need to be serious about this. One of the results of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe was that Spain and Portugal were both overrun and conquered by the French. And as a result, the nations that had been part of the Spanish and Portuguese empires um, uh, began to declare their independence from the nation of Spain. There was a series of wars of liberation in Latin America starting in about 1811 or so. Spain eventually lost almost all of its American empire. All that remained of what had been this vast uh, empire was Cuba, Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, um, there in the Caribbean. In 1822, European rulers attempted to restore monarchical legitimacy. That's in quotes, monarchical legitimacy. In other words, the legitimacy of kings. Rumors began to fly that Spain was going to attempt to restore their authority in Latin America. Monroe and Secretary of War Calhoun were alarmed at that possibility, although Secretary of State John Quincy Adams was a realist, and he said that it was unlikely. Nevertheless, Adams was working for Monroe. The British were also concerned and suggested that an Anglo-American, an English-American attempt to protect Latin America from Spanish control would be appropriate. Monroe at first agreed, based on the advice of both Jefferson and Madison. However, Adams urged John Quincy Adams emerged an independent course of action, proclaiming a unilateral, that means one way, right? A one-way policy against the restoration of Spain's colonies. In other words, the United States would not be partnering with anyone to accomplish this. We would do this on our own. He said it would be more dignified to avow our purposes explicitly than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of a British man of war. The assumption that was made was that, remember, who was the most powerful military, most powerful navy, and most powerful economy in the Western world? That was England. And the assumption was that anytime that the United States partnered with the British, anytime that happened, the British would always be the senior partner. They would always be the one who had the most influence. And so that makes more sense. This quote makes more sense if you know that. It would be more dignified to avow our purposes explicitly. In other words, let's go ahead and be upfront. Let's tell the world that if we do anything, it's going to be us and us alone, rather than to come in a cockboat, in a little John boat, in the wake of a British man of war. Adams knew England would stop any European action in Latin America. But he also felt that European intervention was simply a rumor with no substance. So Adams was not worried about this rumor at all. First of all, he said if it was true, the British would stop it. But more than likely, it was just a rumor. It had no substance to it. The British wanted a U.S. commitment not to acquire any more Spanish territory. Now, what territory did had the Spanish owned before all these revolutions? What territory had they owned that was close to the United States? Well, a lot of important territory. How about Texas, Cuba, California? The British wanted the Americans to say up front that we are not going to take any of that territory that used to belong to Spain. Monroe incorporated Adams's views into his State of the Union address in 1823. Now, let's talk about State of the Union addresses. The Constitution says that periodically the president will make a statement on the so-called State of the Union, the condition of the Union. Now, it doesn't say how often it'll take place. It just says that he will do it periodically. There was a time when presidents would do it once every 4 years. Here a while back, it started, presidents began to give that speech once every year, and we continue to do it once every year now. Well, in the 1823 edition of the State of the Union Address, Monroe incorporated Adams's views into the State of the Union speech. What is the main content of the Monroe Doctrine? Well, I'm going to read the original language first, and then I'll sort of interpret it for you, okay? Because quite often the language is rather flowery, complicated. Okay, number one, this is the first thing that the Monroe Doctrine said. The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Now, the good thing about these videos is that you can run back and forth. I don't have to repeat myself too much. What does that mean? It means that after today, after I make this announcement, the Western Hemisphere, Northern, Southern, North America, South America, Central America, are off limits for colonization by any European power. It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Two, European political systems are different from those of the U.S., which would consider European efforts to extend their political system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. Yeah. The United States had, what was our political system? It was a democratic republic, wasn't it? What were the political systems of most of the European nations? They were monarchies. Now, there are different kinds of monarchies, but the bottom line is that all of these countries were ruled by either kings or queens. And there are big differences between between democratic republics and monarchies. They're so different that they would be dangerous to try to start any of those monarchies here in the Western Hemisphere. Number three, the third thing that the Monroe Doctrine asserted, the United States would not interfere with any existing European colonies. All right. The United States does not want to appear to be unreasonable here. Now, the first two items were pretty confrontational, really, if the Europeans had chosen to perceive them as being confrontational. No more European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. No more kings and queens in the Western Hemisphere. And so, in number 3, they sort of tone it down. They simply say that if any colonies already exist, you can't make any, you can't create any new colonies. But if any old colonies have survived that transition, then those colonies will be permitted to continue to exist. And number 4, the United States would stay out of the internal affairs of European nations and their wars. The United States is not going to stick their nose in the business of European uh, countries unless it violates any previous part of the Monroe Doctrine. Otherwise, we're going to let you go your merry way. We're going to stay out of your business. We're not going to stick our nose in your business. We're not going to stick our nose up under your tent, as it were. Now, at the time of its creation, oh, by the way, the Monroe Doctrine, many students think that because it's called the Monroe Doctrine, that it was written by James Monroe, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It was written by Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. At the time of the creation of the Monroe Doctrine, the doctrine itself drew very little attention uh, in either the United States or around the world. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even called the Monroe Doctrine until 1852. Now, you've got to understand that in 1823, when the Monroe Doctrine was created, the United States was not, they were a second or a third rate military and economic power. Greatness for the United States was over the horizon, right? We were not powerful economically, we were not powerful militarily at all. And so, um, when the Monroe Doctrine was put out and people read it, they fundamentally laughed. Right? Now, over time, as time passed, as the decades passed, the what we now call the Monroe Doctrine became one of the most cherished principles of United States foreign policy. But for the time being, when it was created, the United States remained second-rate power. Because in order to work for the United States, the doctrine required naval supremacy that the United States did not possess and didn't even have close to possessing yet. The Monroe Doctrine had no standing in international law. It couldn't be enforced. Just because we say that we don't want you to establish colonies, right? And just because we say that we don't want kings and queens here, does that mean that the world is going to listen to us? Of course not. It had no standing in international law, and it was simply considered to be a statement of intent by the American president, James Monroe. It didn't even draw enough interest at the time for any European power to notice and renounce it. I mean, it was a non issue. Now, it wouldn't always be a non issue, right? Down the road, it's going to be an extraordinarily important diplomatic document. Not yet. Now, what we have said is that the first two political parties that existed in the United States were the Federalist Party, created by uh, Alexander Hamilton, and the Republican Party, jointly created by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And even though I've not gone into any great detail, let me do that a little bit right here. The Federalist Party made some serious blunders during the War of 1812. And as a result, the Federalist Party began to lose power and influence even before the War of 1812 ended. As a result, John Adams, the second president of the United States, was the last president of the United States to be elected. No one, let me say that again, no one after John Adams, no Federalist after John Adams was ever elected president. Now, a number of Federalists ran for the presidency, but they all lost. Federalist membership in the Federalist Party continued to drop into Congress until the Federalist Party it literally disappeared altogether. Now, the Federalist Party continued to exist, but not in national politics. For example, uh, federalism continued to exist in the United States Supreme Court for quite a while after federalism had disappeared in most other parts of the country. One of the last things that the Federalist President John Adams did before he left office, he nominated a man by the name of John Marshall to be the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And Marshall was uh, voted in by the U.S. Senate. And Marshall, no one knew it at the time, but Marshall was going to serve as the Chief Justice of the United States for 34 years. Long after the Federalist Party was dead, and long after the influence of the Federalist Party should have died, John Marshall, who was a Federalist, single handedly almost kept it alive. Now, there were a number of Supreme Court decisions that literally changed the course of American history in the early years of our republic. And when I say it changed the direction, it created these decisions created a stronger federal government. The first one was known as Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison. This decision was made by the Supreme Court in 1803. What makes Marbury versus Madison? You hear about Marbury versus Madison all the time. What made it so special? What made it unique? Well, uh, Marbury versus Madison was the first time that the Supreme Court struck down a national law and said that that law was unconstitutional. What had happened was this: John Adams uh, was the president, and he was a Federalist, and he had been defeated by Thomas Jefferson, who was a Republican. Uh, Between the election of in November of excuse me of 1800 and the time that Jefferson was inaugurated in March of 1801, that's about a 4-month period. The Jackson that Adams was still the president of the United States. And Adams knew, within reason, that the Federalist Party was in the process of dying. And he loved his party, and so he tried to do what he could to keep his party alive and strong and have meaning. And so one of the things that Adams does he creates a number of new judgeships. Uh, they were, and it was no accident that every one of these new judges was a Federalist. Now remember, uh, one of those new judges was a man by the name of William Marbury. That's the Marbury in Marbury versus Madison. One of them, Adams had appointed Marbury to be a justice of the peace, which is a very minor position, right? Be a justice of the peace uh, in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. Um, but the appointment had not in place. It had to be approved of by the federal government, and it had not been approved of by the time that Jefferson took office. He had been appointed, but it had not. The process had not been complete. Now, Jefferson is now the president, and he knows that Adams has tried to make these so-called midnight appointments. And so Jefferson orders his Secretary of State, James Madison, to uh, sit on those appointments, sit on the documents that authorized those appointments. Now, Marbury, he's the guy who was going to get the appointment if Jefferson would stop sitting on it. Marbury sued. Marbury sued the United States government and demanded that the commission, the authorization for him to become a justice of the peace in Washington, D.C., be delivered. The Marshall Court said that the, uh, the legal argument that Marbury made was unconstitutional. Um, and by deciding that uh, that law was unconstitutional, the Supreme Court assumed the power of judicial review. Now, what is the power of judicial review? It is the idea that the federal courts have the power, the legitimate constitutional power, to say that a law is constitutional or not. This had never been decided before. Uh, so it was, it, we like to think that it was William Marbury who is responsible for the uh, existence of judicial review today, hundreds of years later. But the reality is that it was John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who pushed that opinion and created judicial review. So, the Supreme Court assumed the power of judicial review, and what that meant was that it had the power to determine if the acts of Congress were constitutional or not. That is a huge power to be given to the federal judicial system. Since Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court has struck down over 150 laws of Congress and over 1,500 laws of state legislatures claiming that they were unconstitutional. The power of judicial review is one of the most powerful powers that the federal courts uh, uh, control. Now, not just let me be very careful. I'm saying the federal courts. It's not just the Supreme Court who has the power of judicial review. It's the power of all federal courts. Any federal court at any level can declare that a law of Congress is unconstitutional. Now, there was a second Now, that takes place in 1803. 16 years later, there's another federal case. It's called Mcculloch versus Maryland. Mcculloch versus Maryland, 1819. There were two issues involved in Mcculloch versus Maryland. One issue was the right of the national government to establish the Bank of the United States. So they're still arguing over this, right? This issue is not going away. Americans have been fighting over the idea of the uh, constitutionality of the Bank of the United States since it was first created in 1791, and they continued to argue over it when the charter was revoked in 1811, and even more than that when the bank was recreated in 1816. This is an issue that won't go away. The right of the national government to establish the Bank of the United States is one of the issues. The second issue is the right of Maryland to tax the Bank of the United States once it was established. So you got two issues running at the same time, running concurrently. Remember that when he was the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton had proposed a bill to charter the national bank. Opposition came from Jefferson and Madison, who argued that the Constitution did not provide the national government with the power to establish such a bank, which is a perfect example of a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. The real problem was how to interpret the necessary or proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18. Now, look, by the time you get to History 476, you should have a copy of the Constitution laying around somewhere. All right? Get that copy. I want you to read Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18. And what it says is, and I'm paraphrasing here, Congress has the power to create laws that are necessary and proper for the fulfillment of the terms of the Constitution. Necessary and proper. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. Jefferson, however, the Federalists and the Republicans stressed different parts of the Necessary and Proper Clause. Jefferson argued that necessary meant indispensable. He defined necessary as being indispensable. In other words, it's something that is absolutely critical. And if it's not absolutely critical, then you don't have to worry about it. Hamilton argued that necessary meant convenient. Meanwhile, the first Bank of the United States had died, and we know it died in 1811 when it was not renewed. The second Bank of the United States had been, even after the bank was restored in 1816, the old arguments continued. Maryland, which had opposed the bank, by the way, the state of Maryland had opposed the existence of the Bank of the United States on constitutional grounds. They said, okay, all right, you insist on having the bank, and there's a branch of the Bank of the United States in Baltimore. What we're going to do is, what the state of Maryland is going to do is, we're going to tax that bank. We're going to tax the money that's in that bank. And the bank refused to pay. The bank said, we are a part of the United States government, and states cannot force any part of the United States government to pay taxes. Maryland said, not so. It is not a part of the United States government because it was not created by name in the U.S. Constitution. So the United States government is using a broad argument, a very federalist argument, to justify its existence. And the state of Maryland is using a very Republican, a very narrow interpretation to support its argument. Marshall and the Federalists agreed with Hamilton. That should not surprise us. Hamilton was the creator of the Federalist Party. Marshall was for all of his adult life, he was a practicing Federalist as well. Now, Hamilton was long dead by this time, uh, but Marshall still agrees with Hamilton and still upholds the Hamiltonian ideas. And Marshall, the Supreme Court, of which Marshall is the Chief Justice, ruled that the Constitution does not state that only the powers in Section 8 have to be carried out. And of course, that's a very Federalist idea, too. Remember, Hamilton and people like Marshall said that the Constitution was only a guideline. There were, Marshall believed, powers that are included in the necessary and proper clause. Refer back to Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18. And that those implied powers gave Congress the power to create the Bank of the United States, and that Maryland had no right to tax the federal government. So you can see that these legal arguments are intruding into the constitutional arguments. And rulings such as Madison versus Marbury and Mcculloch versus Maryland were important because it expanded the national government's power over the states. And it reaffirmed this whole idea of implied powers. Now, let's be specific here. What the heck is an implied power? Well, the deal is the theory is that there are several types of powers. There are powers that are pretty straightforward. You know, the Constitution says the Congress has the power to mint money. I mean, nobody denies that the Constitution gives that power to the Congress. But what about an implied power? An implied power is one that is not set in stone. It's not in black and white. There is an assumption that the government has this power, but it's not a concrete power. It's an implied power. Nevertheless, these rulings reaffirmed the implied power interpretation of the Constitution that had already been determined by the Marshall Court. Complicated, folks? You betcha. And we still argue these same points today, more than 200 years later. Here it is, 2021. And we still argue some of these points regularly in federal courts. Now, let's get back to the politics of the thing, though. Remember, we said that there was actually a Federalist presidential candidate in the year 1816, but what was his name? Rufus King. But he was very weak and he didn't do well at all. And Madison just pretty much ran the table on Rufus King. And the result of that was that the so-called era of good feelings, for all practical intents and purposes, the Republican Party was the only party. And if there's only one party, there's really not a party, period, right? I mean, when you really get down and think about it carefully. All right. Now, politics was not really how politics was conducted was rather confusing during this time period. Today, whether you like it or not, usually presidential nominations, for example, are usually pretty straightforward. We have caucuses, we have primaries, and the guy who gets the most delegate votes becomes the candidate of whatever the party is. Now, we've done it in different ways at different times, though. That's not the only way it's been done in the past. Back in those days, in the 1820s, there were any number of ways that presidential candidates, for example, could be selected. Sometimes state legislatures would nominate candidates. Sometimes the Congress itself would nominate candidates. In the election of 1824, there were four main candidates for the presidency. And oddly enough, all four men claimed to be Republicans. Remember, the Federalists have finally died. The Federalist Party no longer exists at the national level. Oh, there still might be some folks back in the states, back in the counties, back in the parishes, who still claim to be Federalists. But there's no one of any power at the national level who is still hanging on to the Federalist Party. Election of 1824, there's only one party, and that party is the Republican Party. Let me first of all give you the names of the candidates, and then we'll go into the details about what they believe. The first candidate for the presidency in 1824 was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Now, once again, uh, James Monroe had served two 8-year terms, and going along with the tradition that had been established by George Washington, Monroe decides to retire, serve 2 terms, and leave office. So it leaves the office of the presidency wide open. John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, announces that he would like to become the president. Also, Monroe's Secretary of the Treasury, a man by the name of William Crawford, also announces that he too is running for the office of the president. Henry Clay, who from Kentucky, who is a member of the United States House of Representatives and who is the serving Speaker of the House, also announces his candidacy for the presidency. That's 3. So who's the 4th? Well, it's the United States. It's one of the 2 United States senators from the great state of Tennessee, General Senator and General Andrew Jackson. So those are the 4 candidates. Now, only 2 of those 4 men had clearly defined programs. Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury, offered a states' rights and strict constructionist platform. He was a Republican through and through, who believed that you couldn't do anything unless the Constitution specifically gave you permission to do it. And he believed in strong state governments and a rather weak national government. That's what we refer to. That's what we are referring to when we talk about states' rights. Now, these days, when you hear the term states' rights, that's quite often a buzzword for racism. When I was a young man in the 1960s and 70s, uh, whenever a white Southerner would say that he supported states' rights, you knew that was a code that said that he was opposed to black children going to school with white children. That is something that should be decided by the state. That the state had the right to determine who could go to school. States' rights. That's not what Crawford is talking about here. Crawford is simply saying that if you had a choice between giving power to the national government or giving power to the state government, he would support giving power to the state government, state rights. Okay, so let's don't get that confused. Henry Clay offered the so-called American system. Now, I had mentioned that a lecture or two ago, but I did not go into detail because I wanted to do it in this area. What was Clay's idea of the so-called American system? Clay favored the creation of the national bank. Clay favored the creation of a protective tariff. And Clay supported national internal improvements paid for by the national government. Now, I hope that some of you just sat up and you said, wait a minute. That doesn't sound like republicanism. That sounds like federalism. And if you thought so, you'd be right. One of the easy ways to keep the Federalist Party, the beliefs of the Federalist Party, and the beliefs of the Republican Party separate is to learn what one of the parties believes in and then believe the opposite about the other party. Right? I'll give you an example. Historically, the Federalists had supported the National Bank. Remember, it was the Federalist Hamilton who was responsible for creating the National Bank. So, Federalist, National Bank, it all goes together. Why did the Republican Party come into existence? Because they opposed the policies of the Federalist Party. So the Republicans opposed the creation of the National Bank while the Federalists supported it. The Federalists supported the creation of a protective tariff while the Republicans opposed it. The Federalists supported national improvement, internal improvements that were paid for by the national government, and the Republicans opposed it. Pretty clear cut. And yet, here it is in 1824, and a man, Henry Clay, who claims to be a Republican, with the same breath is saying, I support the National Bank, I support the protective tariff, and I support national improvements paid for by the national government. How is this possible? Well, it's the old saying that politics makes strange bedfellows. All four of the candidates for the presidency in 1824 claim to be Republicans. But are they really? I say no. I say that William Crawford is certainly a Republican, but Henry Clay just as certainly is not. It doesn't matter what he says. It doesn't matter that he says that he's a Republican. It doesn't matter that he claims to be a Republican. What does he believe in? He believes in Federalist ideas. Now, John Quincy Adams is, I don't want to use the term wishy-washy because no one could ever accuse John Quincy Adams of being wishy-washy. So let's just say it like this. Adams supported some ideas that were sort of Federalist, and he supported other ideas that were sort of Republican, while claiming to be a Republican. For example, he supported the idea of the very Federalist idea of internal improvements paid for by the national government. That's a very Federalist idea, and yet he's claiming to be a Republican. He he was less strongly committed to the creation of a protective tariff, though. So in that area, he was sort of Republican. And of course, there was always Andrew Jackson. Jackson really didn't want to speak up and tell anybody what he believed. He didn't want to talk about protective tariffs or the Bank of the United States or internal improvements. What Jackson wanted to talk about was I'm a military hero and I saved the city of New Orleans from the British invasion, right? That's what he wanted to talk about. So he avoided political commitment and he hoped to capitalize on his image as a bona fide, now a legitimate, he was a legitimate hero, military hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Well, the time for the election of 1824 rolls around in November of 1824. And as it turned out, the election turned more on personalities and sectional loyalties than on the issues. And the result of the election was inconclusive. All right, let me give you what the Constitution says. What does it take to elect someone to be the president of the United States? Well, the successful candidate has to accomplish two things. The successful candidate has to have the most electoral votes, and that number has to be at least a simple majority of all of the electoral votes that are cast. And if you don't get both, the most, and that number is a majority, then you cannot be elected president of the United States. These results were inconclusive. Jackson winds up with the most electoral votes. He has 99. John Quincy Adams comes in second with 84 electoral votes. William Crawford winds up third with 41 electoral votes. And Henry Clay comes in fourth out of four with 37 electoral votes. And the popular vote ran around the same percentages, okay? One of the reasons why Clay lost so badly was opposition from the area of New England and the state of New York to his American system. Those areas opposed internal improvements paid for by the national government. And for that matter, the South and the Southwest opposed it because of the protective tariff. So Clay is losing on both ends of the spectrum. Now, the Constitution in the 12th Amendment says that if no one is elected outright to the presidency, then the names of the top 3 vote getters will be sent to the U.S. House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives will then choose the new president. There were 4 candidates, right? Jackson, Adams, Crawford, Clay. But according to the 12th Amendment, only the names of the top 3 vote getters can be sent to the House. And what does that mean? That means that Clay is left out. Only the names of Jackson, Adams, and Crawford are sent to the House of Representatives from and those 3 names are the names from which the House of Representatives will now choose the president of the United States. So Clay is out of it. He's the fourth man. His name is not sent to the House. Only the names of Jackson, Adams, and Crawford are sent. Now, Clay, even though Clay is no longer in the running for the presidency, Clay still holds an extraordinarily important position in the United States government. He is the Speaker of the House. He is the third most important person in the entire United States government. And Clay despised Andrew Jackson. I cannot stress that enough. It's not that he just disliked it. He despised him. He felt that Jackson was literally unfit for office. He said, I cannot believe that killing 2,500 Englishmen at New Orleans qualifies for the various difficult and complicated duties of the president. That's what Jackson had run on, wasn't it? He ran on the fact that he was a military hero. He ran on the fact that he had killed 2,500 British soldiers at New Orleans. And the assumption was that if he was a good soldier, he would also make a good president, but that was not necessarily the case. And Clay didn't hesitate to say that. He said, I cannot believe that killing 2,500 Englishmen qualifies him to be president. Now, remember that the top three names of the top three vote getters are sent to the House of Representatives. And I don't want to beat you upside the head with this, but I want it to be obvious to you that that Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, where the next president is going to be decided. And Clay has a lot of influence in the House of Representatives, and Clay hates Jackson. Clay gives his support to John Quincy Adams. Why doesn't he give it to William Crawford? Well, it's very simple. Crawford is very ill. He's elderly. He's ill. No one has any confidence that he will be able to, he'll be alive much longer. And so, fair or not, they sort of mentally kick Crawford out of the mix. And so, as far as Clay is concerned, the only one who's left to oppose Jackson is John Quincy Adams. And so Clay throws his support to John Quincy Adams, former Secretary of State. When the House voted, now remember, when the popular vote, when the electoral vote had been counted, Jackson had 99 votes, Adams had 84, and Crawford had 41. But they vote differently in the House if the election of the president goes to the House. Each state gets one vote. Each state gets one vote. And all it takes to become president of the United States is to get a simple majority. Now, how many states were there then? There were 24. So, what is the simple majority of 24? It's 13, right? Half, which is 12, plus 1. The states vote, they vote state by state, and this is the way it winds up. Adams gets 13 votes, Jackson gets 7, and Crawford gets 4. As it turned out, it's a very costly victory for John Quincy Adams, because rumors began almost immediately that a dirty deal was constructed between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, whose purpose it would be to elect Adams the president. Now, let me stop right here. And I want you to listen very carefully to me. It's been almost 200 years since this election was held. It's been 196 years. No, zero evidence has ever been uncovered that in the slightest supports the idea that Clay and Adams got together, put their heads together, and conspired to cheat Andrew Jackson out of the presidency. There's simply, look, in 200 years, if it could be discovered, I suspect that it would have been discovered long before now. But at the time, many people believed that there was this so-called corrupt bargain. And here is what the bargain supposedly was comprised of. Most U.S. presidents on the way to the White House had served as Secretary of State. Jefferson did, Madison did, Monroe did, and so it was assumed that the legitimate path through the White House to the White House was through the office of the Secretary of State, and of course, John Quincy Adams had also served as the Secretary of State. And the idea, the theory is that Henry Clay knew this, and so here was the deal. Here was the dirty deal that he would support John Quincy Adams in the House of Representatives if John Quincy Adams, as soon as he was elected president, would nominate Henry Clay to be the Secretary of State. That was the deal, right? Clay said, "You help me become, I'll help you become the President of the United States if you help me become the Secretary of State." That was the supposed dirty deal. Once again, let me say that no proof has ever surfaced to support that conspiracy theory. The charge was widely made at the time, and when it got to Jackson, Jackson believed it. Jackson had no reason not to believe it. Why? Well, how about this? Because he got 13 votes, Adams was elected president. And what was one of the first things that Adams did once he became president? He nominated Henry Clay to become Secretary of State. Well, Jackson, when he heard the rumor, and then he heard that Adams had in fact nominated Clay to be the Secretary of State, he assumed that all of the rumor was true. And from the moment that he heard that rumor, it outraged him. And he began to work, even though the next election was only 4 years away. I mean, it was as much as 4 years away. He began to work to be elected in the 1828 election. He said, "The people have been cheated." The campaign to elect Jackson in 1828 began as soon, really, as soon as Andrew Jackson heard the first rumors of the corrupt. All right. That's 59 minutes. That will be enough for this lecture, and I will see you soon with a continuation of John Quincy Adams's presidential administration. See you then.